Throughout this OptiPlex project, I've dealt with a lot of used components. In particular, I did an entire video about GPU selection where I tested several graphics cards, all of which were used, and I thought people might want to see my process from start to finish of what I do when I get one of these cards in, all the way from testing to cleaning to applying fresh thermal paste. And I also realized that people have an aversion to buying used components, GPUs being one of the bigger ones. And I think this has a lot to do with the mining craze and the fact that people are worried about buying a GPU that was previously used for mining. And I could go on and do an entire video about why you shouldn't be so concerned about that, especially if you bought it off eBay or some other marketplace where you're protected in case there's an issue. Now, I've bought several X-mining GPUs, and the only thing I've ever run into were some 480s that were flashed with mining BIOSes, which is an easy fix, and it even got me a small refund. So anyways, I'm getting off track here, but the first thing that I want to do once I get the GPU out of the box would obviously be a visual inspection. Now, I'm looking for cracks or breaks in the PCB, any burn marks from components that suddenly decided to commit suicide, and I also look at the connector pins, make sure the fans spin freely, make sure the card matches the picture of the one on the listing. You know, that kind of stuff. Now, I don't care if this thing looks like it's been living in a troll's butt crack for the past 2 years. I don't want to do anything to this until I've made sure it functions properly, because I don't need the seller using that as some sort of leverage to throw that back on me to deny any sort of claims. So the next thing that I want to do is test it. And to do that, you're going to have to remove your current GPU first, and that starts with scrubbing the drivers. And to do that, we're going to need to download a couple of things first, and I'll go ahead and have links down in the description for all of the software that I'm using in this video. But the first thing that we want to download are the drivers for your GPU from the manufacturer's website, so AMD or NVIDIA. Next, we want to download a program called Display Driver Uninstaller, aka DDU. And I suggest doing this whenever swapping out the GPU because I've seen drivers cause a lot of issues, even when swapping between two identical cards. And DDU can solve a lot of problems. It's honestly the first thing that I try when diagnosing GPU issues. Anyways, once we install DDU, we need to reboot into safe mode. And to do that, you simply just need to hold the Shift key while restarting, and then you want to click Troubleshooting, Advanced, then Startup Settings, and then just click Restart, and then it'll boot up into a menu. You just want to hit F4, and then it'll boot into safe mode. Now, once we're in safe mode, open up DDU, and then select GPU from the first dropdown. It should automatically select the manufacturer you have installed. Just make sure that it's correct, and then go ahead and click Clean and Shut Down. Now, once the system powers off, we can finally remove the old GPU, if it's a dedicated card, and put the new one in. To remove the old card, you want to simply unplug the power supply first, and then I like to power cycle it by holding down the power button for a few seconds, just to make sure we can discharge any residual power. Now, we can remove the GPU by removing the screws, then pushing down on this tab, and then lifting it out. Older boards, as well as less expensive ones, like the one in this OptiPlex, might have a tab that you have to lift up. There are also instances where the lock will be some sort of slider, and this is more typical on vertical mounts. With the old card removed, now you just need to slot the new GPU in. Now, before starting it back up, I make sure that it can't connect to the internet when it gets back into Windows, because if you don't, Windows Update will immediately start trying to download its crap drivers, and I've seen them cause issues. And then at that point I would feel the need to rerun DDU and remove them regardless. Now, once it's back into Windows, you can install the driver, and once it's done, just plug the network cable back in, and I download a few more programs. First, I download GPU-Z, and this is so that I can keep an eye on sensors and things like that, but also so you can check to make sure that it sees it as the proper GPU, and that it hasn't been flashed with a different BIOS to make it appear like a better GPU, which is something that should concern you more than buying an X-mining card, but once again, that's another video. Then I download and install Unigine Heaven as well as Furmark. I'm going to run Heaven first, and then you can use Valley or Superposition as well. It doesn't really matter. And what I'm looking for here are any sort of artifacting or other visual anomalies, and then I want to benchmark it a few times just to make sure the card is scoring where it should. Now, once I've done that, I load up Furmark and immediately run the stress test. letting it run for 3.5 to 4 hours. This will really push the GPU, and if there's some sort of problem, it's likely to exploit that. Anyway, I also have GPU-Z running on the Sensors tab so that I can monitor the temps, clock speeds, voltages, and other things. Now, the last thing that I want to do to test this out is play some actual games, to give it some real-world load. Just pick a few more GPU-intensive titles, and just run it through its paces. If it's managed to do all of that without any hiccups, you should be good to go. Now that I'm done testing, I shut down the system again, and then re-power cycle so I can remove the GPU so that we can start cleaning it. And this 1060 really needs it. I highly suspect that it was used for mining. It's dirty, it smells, all the port covers are here, even the scratch coating is still on the logo on the top. Now, what I'm not going to show you is a full teardown or disassembly tutorial, because the problem is that a teardown can vary greatly between GPUs. For instance, this 1060 SSC is going to be very different than tearing down, say, an EVGA 1080 Ti for the Win 3. What I am going to show you is how to get the heatsink off of this, get the fans out, so that we can clean this thing and get it as close to new as we can reasonably get. We're going to put on some fresh thermal paste, maybe lubricate the fans, and then put it back together. And to do all that, we're going to need some tools and supplies. Alright, so to get this heatsink off, the first thing I'm going to need is obviously some sort of screwdriver, and I'm going to be using this iFixit kit. You can generally get away with like a small Phillips head screwdriver in a lot of cases, but just keep in mind that some GPUs will require other heads, like in the case of this 1060, I'm also going to need a hex head, so just something to keep in mind. But I'm also going to be using this plastic spudger, and I'll get to that in a second. And I also might make use of like these angled pliers, but anyways, let's go ahead and flip this thing over and get this heatsink off. Alright, so the first thing that I want to do is look for anything connecting, anything attached to the heatsink to the PCB before we try to get this heatsink off. And in the case of this 1060, we have two on this one. There's a connection here for this lighting strip for this logo here, and then there's also one on the bottom for the two fans. And I want to go ahead and disconnect that one first, and that's what I'm going to use this plastic spudger for. And why a spudger? Why not use these pliers? Well, that's because these just don't grip very well. Neither did tweezers. I just found that this worked better. And I just don't want to damage this connector or the wires, so I just prefer to use this spudger. And doing this makes getting the heatsink just a little bit easier to get off. But it is a bit fiddly, but eventually you're going to get this loose enough that, yeah, there we go, it's disconnected. All right, so now we can just go ahead and flip this on its face. And the first thing that we're hit with is we can already see this warranty void sticker here. And that might stop some people in their tracks, but you need to stand up and stick it to the man. You're not going to let someone tell you what to do, are you? Really though, these don't really hold any weight, at least not here in the US. They would have to prove that you taking it apart somehow resulted in the failure. So if you took it apart and, I don't know, ran it over with your car, you're not getting that covered. All joking aside though, this might not be the case if you live outside the US, so check your local laws. Regardless, chances are that the card you're pulling apart is outside of the warranty anyway, but it's worth checking with the manufacturer first. Anyways, I believe that these are the only 4 screws on the back of this that we need to remove to get the heatsink off on this card. And while it's pretty typical, it's not always the case. If you're feeling a bit timid, Google a teardown tutorial for your GPU. Me personally, I just like to jump in and figure it out, so let's see if I'm wrong. Alright, so Alright, so just set our screws aside, and now we can just go ahead and lift off the heatsink here. just remembering that we still have one of our cables attached here at the lighting strip. And let's just go ahead and disconnect that. It might be a little tough to get out. Oh my gosh, finally. That really chewed up my finger. Anyways, the first thing that I want to do when I get it apart is clean up the old thermal paste so we don't get it everywhere while we're trying to work on it. And to replace the thermal paste, I'm going to be using some 99% IPA. AKA rubbing alcohol. You can use anything down to like 70% really. I just prefer not to pay someone to dilute it for me. I'm also going to be using some anti-static cloth, but really a paper towel works just as well. I'll also be using some cotton swabs and some Q-tips, because we've talked about this. I'm borderline OCD, I know. Anyways, we'll obviously need some thermal paste, and I'm also going to be using this plastic razor, and I'll be getting into that more when we're getting ready to put it back together. Alright, so since there's a lot of excess here, I'm just going to use a paper towel to clean the majority of it off, and this is actually still pretty decent paste, but we're going to replace it anyway. And then on the die, I'm just going to use a Q-tip. And then I'm just going to follow this up using the alcohol. And this will get rid of any leftover residue from the thermal paste. Now, if there's thermal paste that gets stuck between any of these surface mount components around the GPU die package, I like to just use a toothbrush just gently to clean that out of there. Now, it doesn't really matter as long as you're not using some conductive paste, but again. Now, I'm going to set the PCB aside and get the shroud off of this heatsink. And to do that, it's pretty easy on this model. We just have 4 screws, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom. And we're just going to use a hex head to do this. Now we have screws that are holding the fans in, but these are also holding the shroud to the heatsink, so we have to remove them as well. And they're just in between the fan blades. And we just need to use a Phillips head and get these 3 out. Now, something to remember is that not all cards are put together this way. Like I said before, some might actually be screwed to the heatsink, and you can get the shroud off before unscrewing the fans. Some are screwed entirely to the shroud and not screwed to the heatsink in any way. It just varies from card to card. But anyway, now we can go ahead and lift up our shroud, and then you're typically going to have something holding down the fan cables and stuff like that, but there's really nothing on this heatsink. But some have some cable hold downs that you might need to use some pliers to bend them to get the cable out. And now we can go ahead and just remove the fans. On this one we have some tape on the bottom here, just pull it up. And then go ahead and just finagle the fan out. And back through. Just careful to not break any of the fan blades while you're doing it. It's a bit fiddly. Now we can go ahead and clean all of this up. I'm just going to be using more Q-tips, a toothbrush, various forms of Windex, some cloths, paper towels, some canned air, or a data vac. Now, you can use a compressor with a high pressure nozzle. Just know what you're doing and turn down the regulator and don't get the nozzle too close to the PCB. I've seen components blow clean off of a PCB before because people weren't careful and didn't know what they were doing. Now I'm going to go ahead and start by blowing dust off of everything to get most of the excess off. If you're leaving the fan shroud on, make sure to keep the fans from spinning. If you don't, you're going to overspin the bearing and you can burn it up. Now there's still going to be a lot of dust stuck to crap, and this is where the Q-tips, toothbrush, and everything else really comes into play. I'm just going to scrub and wipe everything down and get this as close to new as I can possibly get it looking. And now I've set all of that aside, and now I'm just going to grab the PCB. Now, you might be able to see it, you might not, but there's this oily residue. Don't freak out and think that there's something wrong. I've even seen a dude that was trying to sell a used graphics card that he just bought because it was wet and must obviously be ruined. However, this oil is just a byproduct of the thermal pads heating up, and it's typical, especially on EVGA cards. This oil is not conductive and isn't anything to worry about. Anyways, now I'm just going to do the same thing to the PCB here. Now, because this has a front plate, I can just wipe this down, but if the PCB were bare, I would just use a toothbrush gently to clean up, any excess dust around components and off of the PCB and whatnot. Alright, now with everything cleaned off, I'm going to go ahead and just follow it up and blow it off a second time to get any excess leftover dust off. Before putting on new paste and slapping it back together, I like to go ahead and re-lubricate these fans. And I'm just going to be using an X-Acto knife to peel up the sticker on the back. And I'm also going to be using this oil that I use to lube the bearings on my carry knives. It's excellent oil, but also it has this needle style applicator, which is just perfect for this. So let's just get under here, and what we're going to do is get under the label here, and then I'm going to peel it back just far enough to expose the bearing. Do this on the other one. Now, sometimes these won't be serviceable. I've actually seen this on Zotac cards where the bearing is sealed off and you can't really lubricate it. But anyways, I just need to add some oil here. And I'm just gonna squeeze this until you see the oil build up on the end and just drop it in. And now we can just go ahead and put the stickers back on. Now what's cool about this is if you have a noisy fan, this can actually work to get it back to normal so that it's not making noise. But if the fan is bad enough that it's not spinning freely, it's completely borked and you're just going to have to replace it. So the last thing to do is to add some fresh thermal paste. And I'm just going to hurry and re-clean the die package here using a Q-tip just to make sure there's nothing left on it. And just, wipe off the excess with this anti-static cloth. Like I said, paper towel's fine. And anyways, I like using MX4 because this is a really good paste and it spreads easily. Which is actually the preferred method for exposed die packages like a GPU because you want to make sure that you have full coverage. So I'm just going to go ahead and put some on using my finger to spread it out. Now, if we just put the heatsink back on now, we could actually end up with air bubbles, and that's where this plastic razor comes in. You can actually just use this to flatten out the spread, so we eliminate that problem. You could use something like a credit card, and it'll work just as well. Now, in reverse order, we can go ahead and start reassembling. Alright, now we're to the point where we can pretty much sandwich this thing back together. But don't forget to reconnect that lighting cable first. So go ahead and just set that here. And get this pain in the butt reconnected. Alright, and so now with the heatsink face down, I'm just going to go ahead and drop the PCB onto the heatsink, lining up the holes in the PCB with the screw points on the cold plate. I am going to have to angle this thing in because there's this little notch on this particular card that makes it kind of difficult. But once I got that in, we can just drop this down. Alright, so now we can go ahead and screw the heatsink back onto the PCB. And I like to do this in kind of a crosshatch pattern. It's kind of my automotive side showing through, but I do like to just make sure that I'm putting even torque distribution across the GPU die because, I mean, even though the probability is incredibly slim, there is the potential to crack it. So once again, I am a tad bit pedantic, but anyways, we just want to get these screws hand tight. There's no reason to torque these down and try to get them to like 95 foot-pounds like you're torquing the lug nuts on some wheels or something. Just hand tight, because like I said, there's that slight potential. And don't be a dingus and forget to plug the fans back in like I did. So now we have what basically looks like a new GPU. Thankfully this card was just a little dirty. Sometimes the dust can really get caked on, but this was pretty easy. Just keep in mind that your results may vary. Anyhow, thanks for watching. I hope you found this useful. If you did, you could toss it a like and maybe check my other videos. You can also subscribe to see when I upload new videos, and leave any comments or questions down below. I try to get to all of them. As always, any products, tools, or software used in this video will be linked down in the description. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you with the next one.